Welcome to Astral Time Walker, a history sleep story channel designed to help you relax, unwind, and fall asleep while drifting gently through the past. In this video, you will be calmly guided through a third-person retelling of what it was like to live as a lighthouse keeper in 1820 England. The narration will slowly fade into a soothing auditory ambience, aimed to gently put you to sleep. Turn your brightness low, your volume at a comfortable level, and your mind to rest. Enjoy. Chapter 1. Arrival at the edge of the world. The sea did not release a man easily. Thomas knew this as the fishing boat. The Pilgrim's Hope bucked beneath him, each wave a cold, grey hand trying to claw him back from the shore. He clutched his sea chest, its wood slick with salt spray, and stared at the approaching cliffs of Cornwall. It was spring of 1820, but the wind held the bite of winter, carrying the scent of wet stone and rotting kelch. In his coat pocket, folded against his heart, was his letter of appointment from Trinity House, its wax seal a tangible promise of solid ground and purpose after years of unmoored wandering on merchant ships. The cove was no harbour, merely a fissure in the black rock where a small dinghy might land in a calm tide. Today was not calm. The fisherman, a silent man named Davies, gestured with a calloused thumb toward the sheer face. Thomas's eyes followed the line of the cliff upward, and there it stood, the lighthouse, a whitewashed stone tower, stark and solitary against the bruised sky, built in the severe, functional style of the early Stevenson designs. It was both a sentinel and a prison, a needle of order stitched into the chaotic tapestry of the Atlantic frontier. Davies brought the boat as close as he dared to the slick steps carved into the rock. Thomas moved with the practiced balance of a sailor, hauling his chest onto the wet stone before the next swell could dash them both against it. No words were exchanged. A curt nod was the only farewell. Thomas watched the Pilgrim's Hope turn and vanish behind a curtain of spray, the sound of its engine swallowed by the roar of the sea. He was alone with the wind and the crying gulls. The climb up the cliff path was a trial. The wind tore at his greatcoat, and the wicker-covered bottle of brandy in his chest clinked a lonely rhythm. With each step, the lighthouse grew larger, more imposing. Its base was broad, built to withstand the ocean's fury, tapering gracefully to the lantern room above, its windows dark and watchful. A figure emerged from a low adjoining cottage, hunched against the gale. This was John, the retiring keeper. John was a man carved from the same granite as the cliffs, his face a map of wrinkles drawn by decades of salt-laden wind. His handshake was firm, his eyes appraising. Without ceremony, he led Thomas inside the cottage, a single room that served as the living quarters. It was Spartan to the point of austerity, a hearth of blackened stone, a narrow cot with a thin mattress, a rough-hewn table and single chair, and shelves holding a few tin plates and cups. The air smelled of wood smoke, damp wool, and the faint, fishy tang of whale oil. From a hook by the door, John took a large iron key. He led Thomas out and around to the tower's heavy oak door. The interior was a world of echoes and cold stone. A narrow, spiralling staircase wound upwards into shadow. They climbed, their footsteps hollow in the cylindrical space, until they emerged into the lantern room. Here, the world opened up. Through the tall glass panes, the entire angry expanse of the ocean was visible, a vast heaving plain of grey and white. In the centre of the room stood the lamp, the heart of the place. John's hands, gnarled but precise, moved over it with a kind of reverence. He explained the apparatus, an argand lamp, its cylindrical wick housed within a glass chimney, sitting before a large parabolic reflector made of polished silvered copper. The whole assembly was mounted on a clockwork carriage. Every evening at dusk, Thomas would light the lamp, its flame fed by a reservoir of refined whale oil. The clockwork, driven by a descending weight, would then slowly rotate the reflector, sweeping the amplified beam across the seascape. It must be extinguished at dawn. The glass must be kept impeccably clean. The mechanism must be wound. The logbook must be meticulously filled. John's instructions were clear, stripped of poetry, each one a link in a chain of responsibility that stretched out to every ship fighting its way through the night. Thomas absorbed it all, the technical details layering over the profound silence of the place. The weight of it began to settle on his shoulders. A physical pressure. This was not a ship with a crew. Here, any failure was his alone. John showed him the small storeroom with its barrels of oil, the tools for maintenance, and finally handed him the key. His own bag was already packed by the cottage door. He offered a final long look at the tower, his home for 15 years, then clapped Thomas on the shoulder, a gesture that felt like a transfer of guardianship. Thomas watched from the gallery as the old keeper descended the cliff path to where a different fishing boat now waited in a temporary lull. He did not look back. Soon he was a dark speck on the water, and then he was gone. Silence rushed in, deeper and more profound than any Thomas had known. It was not an absence of sound, but a new composition, the basso profundo of waves crashing against the cliffs, the sigh of the wind around the tower's curve, the distant shriek of a seabird. He stood in the lantern room as the afternoon light began to fail, painting the clouds in shades of lead and tarnished silver. The vast, empty beauty of the landscape was terrifying in its indifference. He was a speck himself now, a keeper of the flame on the edge of the world. The letter from Trinity House was no longer just an appointment, it was a covenant. He descended to the cottage, built a small fire in the hearth, and waited for his first dusk, the immense responsibility, a cold, solid companion in the quiet room. Chapter 2: The Rhythm of the Light, Part 1. The darkness before dawn was absolute, a velvet blackness that pressed against the glass. Thomas woke not to a bell or a call, but to an internal tide, the legacy of a sailor's watch. The cottage was a cave of shadows, the embers in the hearth a single, dying red eye. He dressed quickly in the chill, the wool of his trousers and jacket stiff and cold, and lit a hand lantern. Its small, jaundiced flame revealed his breath hanging in the air as he took the heavy iron key and stepped into the tower's throat. The spiral stairs were a stone corkscrew, each step worn concave by decades of solitary ascents. His lantern cast a wobbling circle of light on the curving wall, illuminating patches of rough masonry and beads of condensation. The only sounds were the scuff of his boots, the creak of the wooden handrail, and the distant, eternal percussion of the sea below. He climbed into the lingering night, the air growing colder as he rose, until he pushed open the trapdoor and entered the lantern room. Here, the world was a dome of black glass. He set his lantern down and moved to the eastern panes. Dawn was a mere suggestion, a faint lightening of the horizon, from ink to a deep, bruised blue. This was the time for the first and most vital ritual, the cleaning. John's instructions echoed in the silent space. Clarity was everything. A single smudge on a pane could scatter the precious beam, creating a phantom light or a dangerous dimming. He fetched the bucket and rags from a cupboard, the vinegar solution sharp in the cold air. Working methodically, he began to wash each massive pane of glass, inside and out. The vinegar cut through the salt rime left by the sea spray, leaving streaks that were buffed away with a dry, soft cloth until the surface vanished. As he worked, the world outside gradually unveiled itself. The sea transformed from a void into a heaving, lead-coloured plain. The cliffs emerged from shadow, their edges sharp against the lightening sky. The task was meditative, his own reflection, a pale ghost superimposed on the awakening ocean. He polished each brass frame until it gleamed, understanding now that this daily act was not mere housekeeping, but a sacrament to the light. By the time the sun breached the horizon, a sliver of fire on the water, the lantern room was spotless, the glass invisible. He extinguished the great lamp, its chimney still warm from the night's vigil, and watched the tendril of smoke rise and dissipate. The morning light, now flooding the room, felt thin and clinical compared to the lamp's focused golden beam. He recorded the extinguishing in the logbook on its small desk, noting the time and the clear conditions with a firm, careful hand. The log was a ledger of vigilance, proof for the Trinity House inspectors, but also a chronicle for himself. The day unspooled in a quiet cadence. He descended to the cottage, boiled water for porridge over the rekindled fire, and ate looking out the small window at the gulls wheeling over the cove. The solitude was a physical presence, a third occupant in the room. He walked the perimeter of the tower, checking the stonework for new cracks, the whitewash for blistering. The salt was a relentless enemy, seeking to corrode metal and crumble mortar. In the storeroom, he took inventory. 3 full barrels of whale oil, a crate of spare wicks, a canister of clockwork grease, sacks of oats and beans. The supply boat was not due for weeks. Self-sufficiency was not a virtue here, it was a law. As the afternoon sun began its long decline, casting the tower's shadow far out to sea, like a sundial's gnomon, the rhythm called him back upward. Sunset preparation was a ceremony of precision. He first attended to the clockwork mechanism in the space below the lantern room. It was a beautiful, brute piece of engineering. Gears of cast iron, a drum wound with thick hemp rope, and the great iron weight that would descend through the core of the tower, driving the rotation. He checked its bearings, added a dab of grease where metal met metal, and wound it with a steady, practiced pull on the winch handle, hearing the satisfying click of the ratchet. The weight rose, potential energy stored in its mass. In the lantern room, he turned to the lamp itself. Using a small sharp knife, he trimmed the carbonized edge from the cylindrical wick, ensuring it would burn with a clean, even flame. He then carefully filled the reservoir from a copper can, the whale oil thick and pungent, the smell immediately evoking memories of forecastles and night watches. He checked the flow valve and polished the parabolic reflector one final time, his own distorted face swelling and shrinking in its curved silver surface. Every action was deliberate, a sequence learned and now owned. When the sun dipped below the western horizon, setting the sky ablaze with streaks of orange and purple, he took the tinderbox from its niche. The flint struck steel, the sparks caught on the char cloth, a tiny glow that he nurtured with his breath onto a twist of hemp. He touched this to the lamp's wick. For a heart-stopping moment, nothing happened. Then with a soft whoosh, the flame sprang to life, steadying within its glass chimney. It was a humble yellow flame, but as he engaged the clockwork and the reflector began its slow, stately rotation, the transformation occurred. The flame was captured, focused, and projected into a piercing beam of light that sliced through the deepening twilight. He watched it sweep across the darkening water, a solid bar of gold cutting the gathering gloom. He recorded the lighting in the logbook. Lit at 7:30, clear skies, moderate westerly wind, all apparatus functioning. The words felt inadequate to describe the act. Below, in the cottage, the evening stretched before him, an expanse of quiet. He sat by the hearth, listening to the waves and the rhythmic tick-tick-tick of the clockwork descending through the floorboards. His mind drifted to his past, to the crowded, noisy world of ships, the shouted orders, the camaraderie born of shared peril. This was a different kind of watch, a solitary vigil where the enemy was not a foreign navy or a raging storm, but inattention, forgetfulness, a moment's lapse. The weight of it was immense, but within the strict rhythm of the day, the cleaning, the winding, the lighting, he found a strange, austere peace. The lighthouse was no longer just a tower, it was a heartbeat, and he was its keeper, alone with the sea and the turning light. Chapter 2. The Rhythm of the Light, Part 2. The rhythm deepened, etching itself into Thomas's bones over the following weeks. The solitary days were no longer a string of isolated tasks, but a seamless flowing ritual, each action a necessary note in a silent symphony of maintenance and watchfulness. He rose in the dark, cleaned the glass as the world lightened, wound the clockwork with its satisfying heft, and tended the flame at dusk. But between these pillars of duty stretched the detailed work of preservation, a slow war against the relentless elements. Each morning after his porridge, he would mix lime and water in a wooden bucket to create a fresh whitewash. With a broad brush, he would patch the tower's exterior where the salt spray had scoured the coating away, leaving the grey stone exposed like a wound. The whitewash was not merely for appearance, it protected the mortar from the sea's corrosive breath. He scrubbed the brass fittings on the external door and the gallery railing with a paste of vinegar and salt until they shone like captive suns. He checked the structural integrity of the stone, running his hands over the joints, feeling for any hint of movement or softness, knowing the tower's steadfastness was the foundation of everything. He learned the language of the sky and the sea, knowledge passed down from mariners, and now his only conversation partner. A mackerel sky, high and rippled, foretold a change within a day. The gathering of gulls in a silent floating flock inshore hinted at a coming storm far out at sea. A halo around the moon spoke of ice crystals in the high air, promising wind. He kept a barometer on the cottage wall and noted its gentle falls and steady rises in his log, correlating them with the weather he observed. The world became a text to be read, its signs vital to his preparedness. One still afternoon, with the sea a placid sheet of hammered silver, he dedicated hours to the heart of the light, the parabolic reflector. He removed it from its carriage with immense care, laying it on a padded bench. With a soft cloth and a special polish made from fine chalk and spirits, he began to work on the silvered copper surface. His own reflection swam in the distorted curve, a solemn, focused man in a pool of liquid metal. He polished in slow, concentric circles, removing every microscopic smear and tarnish spot. He understood now, viscerally, what John had meant. This was not vanity. Even a faint film could diffuse the beam, stealing precious candle power, turning a piercing guide into a vague glow. Each stroke of the cloth was a promise to an unknown shipmaster, somewhere in the future dark. The routine was shattered one Tuesday by the sight of a cutter flying the Trinity House pennant, beating its way toward the cove. The inspector's visit was unexpected, a test of his daily discipline. Mr. Henderson was a tall, austere man in a dark coat, his eyes missing nothing. He examined the logbook first, his finger tracing the daily entries. He climbed to the lantern room in the daylight, inspected the spotless glass, tested the smoothness of the clockwork's rotation, and sniffed at the oil reservoir for any hint of contamination. He asked sharp technical questions about the lamp's airflow and the weight's descent rate. Thomas answered with a quiet confidence that surprised him, his hands demonstrating the procedures as he spoke. After a thorough hour, Mr. Henderson's severe expression softened into something akin to approval. He commended the order of the storeroom and the gleam of the reflector. Over a cup of bitter tea in the cottage, he shared a piece of history. The Lighthouse Act of 1819, he explained, had granted Trinity House greater funds and authority. It was part of a national push for safer coasts, driven by the expansion of trade after the Napoleonic Wars. "You are not just a keeper of a flame, Mr. Thomas," he said, his tone losing its official edge. "You are a civil servant of the sea, a point of order in the chaos." His words framed the isolation within a larger, noble context, planting a seed of quiet pride. After the cutter disappeared over the horizon, the silence felt different. It was no longer an empty void, but a familiar medium. Thomas found he knew the lighthouse's voice intimately, the specific creak of the third step on the spiral stair, the low groan the tower gave when a southwesterly gale pressed against it, the rhythmic tick-tick-tick of the clockwork that had become the metronome of his nights. The wind's howl was no longer just a noise, it was a conversation, its pitch telling him of its speed and direction. The pangs of loneliness still came, often in the long twilight after the lamp was lit, when the world outside vanished and the circle of firelight in the cottage felt terribly small. He would think of taverns in bustling ports, the warmth of crowded rooms, but the feeling was now countered by the rhythm itself. The discipline was a bulwark. The knowledge that his precise, boring tasks, the scrubbing, the polishing, the winding, were what kept the beam piercing the dark, gave the solitude a purpose that felt like a kind of companionship. He was mastering a vital, silent skill. The lighthouse was no longer just a place he inhabited. It was a mechanism he had become part of, his own heartbeat syncing with the descent of the weight, his vigilance the oil that fed the flame. The rhythm was not a chain, but an anchor, holding him steady in the vast and whispering dark. Chapter 3. The Sea's Whisper. The supply boat was a speck of brown canvas against the grey sea, growing slowly into the familiar, tubby hull of the Molly Grey. Thomas watched from the gallery as she rounded the headland, her master, Eli, skillfully navigating the surge to bring her alongside the rock landing. The monthly delivery was more than a replenishment of stores. It was a thread connecting the solitary tower to the world of men. Thomas descended the path to meet the boat, the salt wind sharp in his lungs. Eli was a man shaped by the sea, his face a landscape of weathered crevices, his eyes the pale blue of shallow coastal waters. He moved with the rolling gait of one who spent more time on decks than on land. Together they unloaded the cargo, 2 new barrels of whale oil, heavy and pungent, sacks of flour and oats, a crate containing candles, wicks and a wrapped parcel of salt pork. The work was done with the efficient silence of those accustomed to labour, but as they secured the last barrel in the storeroom, Eli leaned against the doorframe and produced a clay pipe. "Quiet up here, is it?" he asked, though it was not a question. He lit the pipe, the smoke whisked away by the wind. "Porth Haven's buzzing. The Lydia made port from Bristol, with a hold full of Welsh coal. Captain says he saw your light clear from 10 leagues out in the Mizzle last week." He spoke of the village, a cluster of cottages 3 miles east along the cliff path, as if describing the capital. News was a currency here, and Eli was a rich man. He spoke of a wedding, a dispute over fishing grounds, the birth of a child. Then he fixed Thomas with a look. "You ought to come down when the weather softens. A man can't live on sea air and silence alone. The anchor has a fire, and the ale's passable." The invitation hung in the air, a tangible breach in the perimeter of Thomas's isolation. He nodded, a non-committal gesture, but the idea took root. Days later, a rare calm descended. The barometer held steady. The wind dropped to a whisper, and the sea lay like a vast sheet of wrinkled silk under a high, soft sun. The path to Porthaven, a narrow track worn into the cliff's grassy shoulder, beckoned. Thomas left the tower in the quiet afternoon, the logbook updated, the lamp prepared for evening. Walking felt strange, purposeful, in a way his circumscribed patrols were not. The village revealed itself gradually. First the smell, a complex bouquet of wood smoke, drying fish and the rich damp scent of peat. Then the sight of slate roofs, huddled around a small crescent-shaped harbour. Fishing boats, their sails furled, bobbed at moorings, painted in faded blues and reds. The cottages were built of the same grey stone as the cliffs, their walls thick against the gales. The Anchor Tavern was marked by a sign creaking on iron hinges, depicting a rust-coloured anchor. Pushing open the heavy door, Thomas was met by a wall of warmth, the murmur of voices, and the earthy smell of ale and damp wool. Conversation stuttered for a moment as the locals, men with faces as lined as Eli's, took in the stranger. Then Eli raised a hand from a corner table. "The keeper's come down from his perch," he announced, and the tension broke. A mug of dark ale was placed before Thomas. The men were fishermen, their lives dictated by tides and seasons. They spoke in the broad, rolling accent of Cornwall, their words often swallowed by the crackle of the large peat fire. The tales began slowly, like a net being drawn in. An old man named Jory, with fingers knotted like rope, spoke of the winter of '09, when the Grace of Fowey was driven onto the Black Rocks in a blizzard. "We were giving her up for lost," he said, his voice a low rasp. Then the old keeper, a 4 John, he kept that light burning though the storm was shaking the tower to pieces. The beam cut through the snow like God's own finger. Captain saw it, hauled hard to starboard on a prayer, and found the channel. 20 souls walked ashore here next day. He nodded at Thomas, a grave acknowledgement. Then came the older stories, the ones woven from mist and moonlight. Tales of the merry maids, their word for mermaids, who were said to sit on the offshore rocks called the Sisters, combing their hair and singing songs that could lure a man onto the reefs. Stories of the Bucker, a storm spirit whose breath was the gale, who could be appeased by leaving a scrap of bread or fish on the shore. They were not told as mere fancy, but as explanations for the unexplainable, a way to give shape to the sea's capricious violence. Eli explained the practicalities. The lighthouse's beam was a fixed point in their universe. It told them where the land was when the fog cloaked everything. It guarded the approaches to their harbour, which saw more traffic now, with coastal traders moving tin and copper and coal in the peace following Boney's defeat. Thomas listened, the ale warming him. He learned of the herring runs in autumn, the pilchard seasons, the deadly treachery of the reef system that extended like a hidden jaw just west of his tower. Their world was one of communal efforts and shared risk, a stark contrast to his solitary vigil, yet he saw the connection. Their safety, their livelihoods, were tethered to his lonely light. He was not just a sentinel for anonymous ships. He was part of the fabric of this hardy, salt-stained community, The walk back as the sun bled into the western sea was different. The tower, when it came into view, was no longer just a stark column of duty. It was a beacon for the lights now twinkling in the cottages of Porthaven behind him. He carried the warmth of the tavern fire, the texture of the stories, the weight of their gratitude. The sea's whisper, which had been only wind and wave, now seemed to carry the echoes of those voices, the legends of merry maids and the remembered cries of saved sailors. His isolation was not absolute. He was a knot in a net that stretched from the deep water to the hearths of the village. Climbing the stairs to light the lamp that evening, the ritual felt imbued with a new significance. He was not just keeping a light, he was answering the sea's whisper with a steady, unwavering reply. Chapter 4. The storm's approach. The change announced itself not with a shout, but with a slow, silent retreat. In late autumn, the gentle days grew scarce, replaced by a brittle, metallic light. The barometer, a handsome mahogany-cased instrument Thomas kept on the cottage wall, began its steady, ominous descent. For days the needle crept downward, a silent herald of the gathering fury. The fall was not sudden, but relentless, like the draining of colour from the world. The sea, which had whispered and chuckled through the summer, fell into a sullen, heaving silence, its surface taking on a dull, leaden hue. Then the sky began to bruise. It was a subtle transformation at first, a faint purple staining the underbellies of the clouds to the northeast. Within a day, the entire dome of the heavens turned the colour of a healing wound, a deep livid purple-black. The wind, which had been capricious, settled into a new and dire quarter, the northeast. It was a different wind altogether, no longer carrying the wet, earthy scents of the land, but a sharp, clean cold that smelled of nothing but distance and ice. It sliced through Thomas's greatcoat as he stood on the gallery, a physical blade of intent. He knew these signs, every sailor did. They were the oldest language in the world, spelling out a single capital word: Gale. A profound, focused calm settled over him. Anxiety was a luxury he could not afford. It would cloud the necessary precision. The storm was coming, and his duty was to ensure the lighthouse stood ready to meet it. He began the methodical work of securing his station. Starting at the base, he checked the heavy oak shutters on the cottage and storeroom windows, hammering fresh wedges into their brackets to batten them fast. He moved to the tower, ensuring the great door was barred and its iron reinforcements secure. His mind became a checklist. Oil. He descended to the storeroom and did a full inventory of the barrels. He tapped them, listening to the hollow versus the full sound, calculating burn rates against a storm that could last days. He rolled 2 fresh barrels to the base of the tower, ready to be hauled up if needed. Wicks. He counted the spares, ensuring a dozen were at hand in the lantern room cupboard. The clockwork mechanism. He climbed to its chamber and wound it fully, the weight rising to the very top of its shaft with a solid, final thunk. He oiled the gears again, though they needed none, his hands moving with a ritualistic care. He checked the integrity of the hemp drive rope for any fraying, finding none. Only when the interior was prepared did he return to the gallery, his spyglass in hand. The sea was now a restless, churning plain of grey and white. In the distance, he could see the tiny, desperate shapes of ships. They were scrambling, their courses converging like iron filings drawn to a magnet, all heading for the sanctuary of Porthaven's harbour. He raised the spyglass, the cold brass biting into his skin. The world leapt closer. He saw a British merchant brig, her sails reefed tight, plunging through the rising swell, a white bone of foam at her bow. Further out, a Dutch schooner, her line sleeker, was making a brave run for it. But even as he watched, she wallowed in a deep trough, her deck awash. He noted their flags, their types, their headings in his log, a detached part of his mind recording the prelude. Each entry felt like a name on a roll call, vessels whose fate would soon be intertwined with the steadfastness of his light. Memories unbidden surfaced through his focus. He recalled the mate on his first ship, an old Dane, describing the great storm of 1703 that had shattered the Eddystone lighthouse and drowned its builder. He thought of more recent, whispered accounts of hurricanes in the Indies that could strip the sea itself from the bedrock. His own experience was of lesser gales, but enough to know the sound a wind makes when it means to kill. A high, keening note that vibrates in the teeth. The tension was not fear, but a heightened awareness, a coiling of every sense. Nature was not malicious, but it was immensely, impersonally powerful. His preparation was a tiny assertion of order against that coming chaos, a sandcastle built before the tide. The first warning spits of rain arrived, horizontal needles driven by the wind. They stung his face as he made one final circuit of the gallery, his hand running along the cold, wet iron of the railing. He looked down at the cliff base where the sea was no longer breaking in regular waves but was beginning to boil, white water churning over the half-submerged rocks. The air grew heavy, not with humidity, but with pressure, the palpable weight of the approaching tempest. It tasted of salt and ozone. The light had a strange greenish cast, the kind that settles in the hour before true violence begins. He descended to the lantern room as the day failed prematurely, swallowed by the rolling purple-black clouds. He lit the lamp earlier than usual, the flame springing up, brave and bright in the gathering gloom. As the clockwork engaged and the beam began its first sweep, he saw it cut through the murk, a solid, golden lance. It looked frail against the immense darkness gathering to the northeast. He secured the ventilation flaps, leaving only the narrowest slit to feed the flame air, and checked the metal storm screen was ready to be slid into place to protect the glass from the worst of the spray. His last act before the storm's full arrival was to stand and watch. The ships had vanished, presumably safe in the lee of the land or battling for position in the crowded harbour. The sea was now a heaving wilderness, the wind's moan rising to a steady roar. The resolve within him was a cold, hard knot. Lives unseen and unknown depended on the constancy of this flame, on the unwavering rotation of this lens, on his own endurance through the coming hours. Every detail he had checked, every barrel rolled, every gear oiled, was a link in a chain he now held. The anxiety was there, a fluttering in his gut, but it was overmastered by the sheer clarity of his purpose. As the first true squall hit the tower, with a sound like a cannon shot, shaking the very stones, Thomas placed a steadying hand on the lamp's brass housing. The storm was here. The vigil had begun. Chapter 5, The Night of the Gale, Part 1. The storm's final furious arrival was not a transition, but an obliteration. One moment, the wind was a roaring beast at the door. The next, the door was gone, and the beast was in the room. Night had fallen, a blackness so complete it felt solid, and into this void the gale poured its full chaotic wrath. The lighthouse, which had stood for decades as an unmoved statement against the sea's tantrums, trembled. It was a deep, granular shudder that Thomas felt first in the soles of his boots, a vibration rising through the stone from the bedrock itself, as if the cliff were grinding its teeth. He was in the lantern room, having just completed a sweep of the gallery before the conditions became impossible. The beam cut its prescribed arc, but now it illuminated a scene of pure madness. Waves, mountains of black water crowned with phosphorescent foam, marched in endless, battering ranks toward the cliffs. They did not break so much as detonate, striking the rock with a thunder that shook the glass in its frames. The spray was no longer mist, but a continuous, horizontal river of salt water, flung so high it sheeted across the lantern room windows, blurring the world into a swirling abstraction of grey and white. The sound was a physical assault, a booming, grinding roar underpinned by the shriek of the wind through every crevice and wire stay, a symphony of annihilation. The rhythm of the light became a frantic physical battle. Thomas descended and ascended the spiral stairs repeatedly, each journey a trial. The wind screaming down the tower's cylindrical throat threatened to pluck him from the steps. He clung to the cold handrail, his lantern extinguished by the draughts, moving in utter blackness, guided only by touch and the memory of step count. In the lantern room, his world shrank to the circle of lamplight. The flame sheltered within its glass chimney nonetheless danced and guttered as draughts, like icy fingers, found their way through the smallest imperfections. He slid the heavy metal storm screen into its grooves before the main windows, a perforated barrier that cut the view to 1,000 tiny rain-lashed hexagons, but protected the precious panes from direct impact. The clockwork mechanism, so reliable in the calm, began to protest. The wind's pressure against the tower and the reflector carriage added a terrible strain. From the chamber below, Thomas heard a new sound, a sharp metallic ping followed by a laboured grinding. He rushed down to find the drive rope, jumping on its drum, a gear threatening to bind. Without hesitation, he seized the manual override handle, a stout iron lever, and fitted it into its socket. For the rest of the night, he would have to supplement the weight-driven rotation with his own muscle, turning the handle in time with the struggling mechanism to keep the beam sweeping at its steady, vital pace. It was exhausting, mindless labour, his shoulders burning, his hands growing raw. But the alternative, a stalled fixed beam, was unthinkable. Between turns of the handle he would climb back to the lamp, shielding its flame with his body as he trimmed the wick, his ears filled with the cacophony. He checked the oil reservoir constantly. The storm was causing the flame to burn hotter, faster. Through the blurred, streaming glass of the storm screen, the world outside was a lesson in chaos. There were no distinct shapes, only movement. The violent sweep of rain, the explosive white of breaking waves, the dizzying lift and fall of the sea's surface. It was the ocean, stripped of all order, reverted to a primal state. Then came the lightning. A vast blue-white fork ripped the sky apart, a celestial wound that blazed for an instant and seared the scene onto his retina. In that frozen, monochromatic flash, he saw it. Not a wave, not a phantom, but a ship. A two-masted brig, her sails in tatters, her deck raked by foam, was lifted on the shoulder of a monstrous swell. She was terrifyingly close, a dark silhouette against the white fury of the breakers, positioned directly in the lethal embrace of the submerged rocks that fanged the cove's western approach. The image vanished with the thunderclap, leaving only the afterglow in his eyes and a cold terror in his chest. His heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic drumbeat against the storm's bass. That ship was alive with men. They were fighting for their lives, their hands on frozen lines, their prayers lost in the wind, and their only hope, their only possible hope, was the steady, golden eye of his lighthouse cutting through this bedlam. The abstract duty of his post crystallized into a desperate personal imperative. He threw his weight onto the manual handle, turning it with a new, frantic energy, his eyes fixed on the lamp. The flame flickered wildly as a particularly violent gust shook the tower to its foundation, causing the metal screen to rattle like a sabre. A draft sneaked through, making the light dip and gutter, threatening to drown in its own glass. With a cry torn from his throat and lost in the storm, Thomas lunged, using his own hands to cup the chimney, shielding the fragile fire with his body, feeling its heat against his palms. He held that position, a human bulwark, as the tower swayed and the world outside screamed, his mind filled with the vision of the brig and the men upon her, their faces turned toward the dark, where his light must be. Chapter 5. The Night of the Gale, Part 2. The brig's reply was not a light but a sound, a single desperate cannon shot fired into the teeth of the gale. The report was a dull, wet thud, utterly swallowed by the wind's shriek and the sea's thunder. It was a cry for help that never reached the shore, a final punctuation of their peril. The silence that followed its absorption was more terrible than the sound itself. Thomas's mind, honed by years at sea, calculated their position from the lightning flash. They were in the lee of the outermost rock, a temporary respite that was a trap. The next set of waves would dash them onto the stone fangs. He acted without conscious thought, muscle memory and duty merging into a single imperative. He could not leave the great lamp, but he had another tool. In a cupboard below the lantern room was the hand lantern, used for exterior repairs. It had coloured glass filters, red and green, that could be slid into place. He fetched it, his movements swift and precise despite the tower's shuddering, and lit its candle with a spill from the argand lamp. He fitted the red glass, creating a small fierce crimson star in his hand. Leaning into the storm screen, he shielded the small lantern with his body and began to signal. Morse code was a formal system not yet adopted, but the language of flickering lights was ancient among mariners. He used a simple repeated pattern, 3 long exposures, 3 short, 3 long, a plea and a direction, danger, turn, turn. He aimed the red beam not at the ship, which was invisible again, but out toward a deeper water, tracing the line of the only safe channel he knew, a narrow, deeper pass between the reefs that led to relative shelter east of the headland. He repeated the pattern over and over, his arm aching from holding the lantern steady against the wind's pummeling, his eyes straining into the chaotic dark. Memories, vivid and unbidden, flooded him, not of theory, but of flesh and fear. The feel of a merchant ship's deck tilting to a 60-degree angle, cold green water swirling around his knees, the sound of a topsail ripping itself to shreds with a report like cannon fire, the taste of salt and bile, and the sight of a coastline looming through spume, knowing it meant death. He had been those men on that brig. He had felt that helpless terror. The recollection was no distraction, it was fuel. It poured a furious personal energy into his vigil. Each sweep of his small red light was a rope thrown across the darkness. Time lost all meaning. It was measured not in minutes, but in the burning ache in his shoulder, the numbness in his fingers, the constant draining roar of the elements. He tended the great lamp in brief, frantic intervals, trimming, refilling oil from a can, then returned to the screen and his signalling. The world was reduced to 2 flames, the large, steady, rotating eye of the lighthouse and the small, darting red tongue of his lantern. He was a man speaking in 2 voices, one a constant, booming declaration of "Here is land," the other a frantic, specific whisper of "Go there." Then after an eternity of repetition, he saw it, a shift in the darkness. Where there had been only formless night, a tiny bobbing pinprick of yellow light appeared. Then another, the brig's lanterns. They were moving. Not much and agonizingly slow, but they were undeniably changing their relationship to the fixed point of his tower. They were sliding eastward, parallel to the cliff face, away from the white, boiling fury that marked the rock field. They were following his red, flickering suggestion. A sob, raw and unexpected, tore from his throat, lost instantly in the wind. He kept signalling, the pattern now one of encouragement, until the ship's lights began to diminish, not from sinking, but from increasing distance, merging with the general tumult as they crept toward the safer water. Dawn came not as a sunrise, but as a gradual grey dilution of the black. The wind dropped from a scream to a mournful howl, then to a tired sigh. The rain ceased its horizontal assault and became a gentle, dripping aftermath. Thomas, his body, a single mass of pain and exhaustion, extinguished the great lamp as the first pallid light revealed the scene. The sea was a wreckage-strewn chaos of white water and swirling spume, littered with branches, barrels, and tangled rope. But the brig was there. He stumbled to the gallery, clutching the rail for support. The ship was anchored a half-mile to the east, in the lee of the headland, her mast standing, her hull intact, and cutting through the heaving grey water toward her was a sight that brought a fresh, hot pressure behind his eyes. A lifeboat, its oars rising and falling with steady purpose, rowed by men from Porthaven. He did not remember descending the stairs. He found himself in the cottage, sitting heavily on his cot, his wet clothes clinging to him, his hands trembling violently. The silence was profound, a ringing void after the night's cacophony. He sat there for a long time, staring at the ashes in the hearth, feeling the adrenaline recede and leaving behind a hollow, trembling exhaustion that was both physical and spiritual. He had held the line. The light had not failed. The ship had turned. Later that day, the sound of boots on stone announced a visitor. It was Eli, his face grimed with salt and effort, but his eyes alight. He brought news and a bottle of brandy. All hands saved. 23 souls. The brig was the Star of Dundee, laden with Baltic timber. Her master, a dour Scotsman, had seen the lighthouse beam, and at the last possible moment, a bloody red flicker to the east. He had thrown his helm over on a desperate gamble. They owed their lives to the keeper's light. The village was already weaving the night into its tapestry of legends. Eli stayed only a short while, leaving the bottle. After he left, Thomas drank a single, burning mouthful, then collapsed onto his cot. Sleep took him not as a rest, but as a sudden total obliteration. The relief was immense, but beneath it lay the stark, unvarnished reality of his duty. A reality measured in the trembling of his hands and the vivid, echoing memory of a cannon shot lost in the wind. The night had passed, the light had held. The cost of that holding was etched into every fibre of his being. Chapter 6. Dawn after the storm. The morning light was a stranger, soft and diffused, as if the world were wrapped in gauze. Thomas woke to a profound silence, broken only by the drip of water from the eaves and the distant, weary sigh of a retreating sea. The storm had exhausted itself, leaving behind a world washed clean and scoured raw. His body ached in every joint, a deep, muscular protest from the night's relentless labour, but a strange, quiet energy propelled him from the cot. He needed to see. Stepping outside, the air was cold and sharp. smelling of wet stone and torn seaweed. He walked a slow circuit around the tower's base, his boots crunching on a strange new litter. Pebbles, clumps of turf ripped from the cliff top, and shattered branches were strewn about. His eyes found the damage quickly. One of the heavy wooden shutters on the cottage had been torn from its upper hinge, hanging askew like a broken wing. The iron bracket was twisted, the wood around it splintered. It was a minor wound, a scratch on the skin of the place. The tower itself, when he tilted his head back to follow its whitewashed rise against the clearing sky, stood unyielding. Not a stone seemed out of place. Its steadfastness in the face of the night's fury felt like a physical truth, a reassurance that seeped into his bones. He climbed the cliff path not toward the village, but westward along the headland. The wind was a gentle breeze now, carrying the raw, salty scent of devastation. The sea, still heaving with the memory of its rage, was a churned expanse of grey and brown, its surface littered with flotsam. And there, along the tide line, at the base of the cliffs, lay the storm's offerings. He picked his way down a rough sheep track to the shingle beach. Splintered planks of pale pine, some as long as a man, were piled among the rocks. Tangled coils of hemp rope, thick as his wrist, lay in sodden nests. A shattered barrel stave, the charred mark of a cooper's brand still visible, a single sodden leather boot. These were the visceral echoes of the Star of Dundee's struggle, the physical proof of how close the abyss had been. He picked up a piece of wood, its edge torn into long fibrous spears, and turned it in his hands. This had been part of her hull, her deck, her very being. Last night it had been under the feet of living men. He placed it gently back on the stones, a kind of secular reverence in the gesture. The walk back was a meditation. The frantic pulse of the night, the screaming wind, the shuddering tower, the desperate signalling, had faded into a series of stark, silent images in his mind. The lightning flash revealing the brig, the feel of the manual handle grinding in his palm, the tiny bobbing lanterns shifting course. The relief was there, a warm, solid core within him, but it was tempered by a new understanding. His duty was not abstract, it was this: the difference between these shattered planks on the shore and the men who had walked away from them. The weight of that difference was immense, and it settled upon him not as a burden, but as a solemn, quiet knowledge. 2 days later, the visitors came. He saw them from the gallery, a small procession winding along the cliff path from Porthaven. Eli led, followed by a dozen villagers, and at their centre walked a man in a dark salt-stained coat, his bearing erect despite a slight limp. They arrived at the cottage, their faces open and grateful. There were handshakes, strong and calloused, and nods that spoke more than words. The women presented a basket containing a fresh loaf, a wedge of yellow cheese, and a jar of blackberry preserves. Humble treasures that felt like royal gifts. Then the man in the dark coat stepped forward. He was Captain MacLeod of the Star of Dundee, his face gaunt with exhaustion, but his eyes clear and direct. He did not offer lengthy thanks. His words were as economical as his seamanship had been desperate. He spoke of seeing the light, of the moment of decision when the red flicker had appeared through the spume, of the feeling of the ship answering her helm and sliding into the deeper water. Then, from inside his coat, he withdrew an object. It was a token carved from whalebone, about the size of Thomas's palm, polished to a smooth, creamy ivory by countless hands. It was a simple rendering of a lighthouse, its beam etched as radiating lines, and on the reverse the initials SOD and the date. From my father, the captain said, his voice rough. "Carved on a whaler in the southern ice. He said it was for the light that saw him home. It has found its proper keeper." He pressed it into Thomas's hand. The bone was warm, its surface impossibly smooth. Thomas could only nod, his throat tight as he closed his fingers around it. The gesture was more than gratitude. It was an acknowledgement of a shared fraternity, a passing of a talisman from one who braved the sea to one who guarded its edge. That moment, there on the windy cliff with the villagers looking on, solidified something intangible. He was no longer just a new keeper, the solitary figure in the tower. He was Thomas, who had held the light. He was woven into the story of the place, into the memories of the families in the cottages below, into the log of the Star of Dundee. His isolation remained, but it was now framed by connection. He belonged. The weeks that followed saw a return to the rhythm, but the rhythm had changed. The tasks were the same, the cleaning, the winding, the polishing. Yet each action carried a deeper resonance. Trimming the wick was no longer just maintenance. It was ensuring the clarity of a voice that could whisper, turn in a gale. Polishing the reflector was honing the edge of a tool that carved safe passage from chaos. He resumed his walks to Porthaven, and now the nods in the tavern were warmer, the conversations easier. He was asked for his account of the storm, and he gave it sparingly, focusing on the facts of the light, deflecting the quiet heroism they tried to assign him. His logbook entries for Trinity House grew more detailed. He included observations on the storm's effect on the light's penetration through spray, notes on the strain on the clockwork, and a careful account of the effectiveness of the hand signal method. He wrote with the understanding that his experience, recorded and submitted, might contribute to the slow, cumulative knowledge that improved safety for all. It was a small part in the great, grinding engine of progress in maritime safety, a personal contribution to the legacy of the Lighthouse Act. As autumn deepened into winter, the days shortened, and the dark gathered earlier each afternoon. One evening, with a chill in the air promising frost, Thomas climbed the tower at dusk. The whalebone token rested in his pocket, a constant smooth weight. He performed the ritual with a calm, unhurried precision. The clockwork wound, the wick trimmed, the reflector gleaming. As the last light bled from the western sky, he struck the flint and touched the flame to the oil. The lamp awoke. He engaged the mechanism, and the beam, that solid bar of gold, swept out across the darkening water, piercing the gathering gloom. He stood at the glass for a long moment, watching its unwavering arc. Below, the sea murmured against the cliffs, a restless, eternal presence. Somewhere out there, beyond the curve of the world, ships were making their way. Captains scanned the horizons, mates checked their charts, ordinary men stood their watches. He thought of them not as abstractions, but as individuals, each with their own fears and hopes, their lives intertwined by the shared vulnerability of the deep. His light was a fixed point in their uncertain world, a promise etched in fire against the dark. It was a silent vow, renewed each dusk, to the sea and to all who sailed upon it. He descended the stairs, the familiar tick-tick-tick of the clockwork, a comforting heartbeat in the stone, and left the light to its watch, a solitary, steadfast eye in the vast and starry night. We have reached the end of this video's narrative section. What follows is a gentle transition into soothing auditory ambience aimed at putting you to sleep for good. I hope you've already drifted off into a deep slumber by this point, but if you have not, do not worry. Put your mind at ease, relax your body, and take a few deep breaths. There is nothing left to do. You have reached the end of your day. Have a good night, and may you sleep well.